This is data for air combat modeling in network-centric warfare. It's kind of a long title, but I think you'll understand what I'm trying to get at as we go along. I have a full agenda. And I'm going to try to move through it pretty quick, but there's some detail that we probably won't cover here. So, of course, the presentation will be available later. Maybe you guys can check it out if you're interested. So who am I? This is some detail about who I am. I got into this largely because of my dad. I was very interested in air combat because of his work at Boeing and the U.S. Air Force. I've been a blogger on mystics and statistics and hope to be doing more of that in the future. And since 2018, I've been resident in Japan, working in business intelligence and artificial intelligence. So I'm going to start with the Persian Gulf air campaign. This is the mother of all briefings by General McPeak, who was chief of staff of the Air Force at the time. I found this on C-SPAN, and I was pretty happy to go through it. It'll be more obvious why I picked this specific one as we get into it. But he does a great job of laying out the Iraqi air threat and how they achieve surprise. And that the second one, understanding the range of the early warning radar and having all the strike packages form up outside of that and get ready with the tankers to make their attack. And of course, the highlights of the war are the stealth bomber and the Tomahawk land attack cruise missile. And that seems to be his focus, those elements of technology. And it's really obvious when you watch this, because just after he explains this, he holds up his model of the F-117. You know, it's obviously something that he's proud of, and I think he should be. So the point was that technology did allow the U.S. Air Force and the coalition Air Force in general to achieve tactical surprise, and they took the initiative. And as he says, the Iraqi Air Force never recovered from those first couple of days. It was just game over for them. So there's another guy, Dr. John Stillian, who was a RAND analyst, and he wrote this report at CSBA talking about trends in air-to-air combat. This is a widely cited report and was used by a lot of the war games that we see currently as, you know, the foundation, the quantitative foundation. For example, the CIS war game. I spoke to them after I read their paper on that war game and asked them, you know, what were your sources? And they definitely mentioned him as a primary source. So I think that he does a great job of laying out what it looked like in the late 80s, what it looked like in Vietnam and Korea, and what it looked like in the 90s. And I've been looking at this as a great source, but it is a secondary source. It's not a primary source. And I'm going to get into the difference and some of the things that he glosses over in a minute. Here's his description of the U.S. Air Force doctrine: first look, first shot, first kill. We'll come back to that. His talking about the side with the superior situational awareness and being able to create an airborne battle network that's capable of bestowing upon the pilots within an advantage in situational awareness. And I think that is true, but it's a little bit one-sided because we're going to poke some holes in this in a moment. He's talking about AWACS coverage and the ability to detect Iraqi combat aircraft even on their takeoff roll, at least for a majority of the air bases in Iraq. That's true. I think that there was a lot of that they were capable of doing that. But again, this is glossing over some of the fine points, some of the detail. So I reread Dupuy's section on technology and human behavior. This is from Understanding War, and he is reminding us, especially Americans, that we tend to focus on technology and less on human behavior. And there's a risk in doing that. We need his third point here. The implicit point is that this is not an experimental science. You can't just rely on the physical aspects of it, right? This is an observational science like astronomy. So I thought that was very relevant as a criticism of the U.S. Air Force, which is really focused on the technology, the newest gadgets. And I think especially as gadgets become more capable, we tend to increasingly focus on the gadgets. And there may be a gap there. So I decided, okay, secondary sources are okay, and it's great to get a foundation and to see how other people have analyzed the data. But it's always great to go back to the primary sources. So this is an example that I'm going to hold up. This is comes from Mongo's MiG Kill, which is a YouTube video where he's interviewed. And so I'll just walk through this just a bit. Point one is that they're coming in and they have an excellent anti-SAM plan. They have tactical air launch decoys, drones, which are there to distract the SAM fire. They have EA-6s, which are launching HAARM missiles in a sequence so that any radars that are going to be emitting are going to be targeted by these HAARM missiles. This is probably the most important point. We did not expect to see enemy aircraft on that mission because we had the Tomcats and earlier in the day Eagles pushing enemies out of the airspace. That was the mindset. Okay, so point two is AWACS. These are communicating by voice. This is not Link 16. And it's pretty obvious that they did get some important cues, but later on in the fight, when the AWACS is overloaded, because you have multiple strike packages coming in, it's very easy for both the AWACS operators to become overloaded and the pilots to become overloaded. I mean, it's very clear. We asked the EW to help us identify them. The E2 did not reply. There's so much radio chatter. Right? It just became very, very difficult to follow the spatial idea of who's where and what. Right? There's many, many points. So point three is that there are very strict rules of engagement. Right? Friendly fire was something that they were really, really afraid of, this is a great example. That this is this MiG-25 kill on the F-18. What Stillian says is, okay, this is basically an exception, right? And the important point here is you have F-18s. They're doing a SEAD mission that MiG-25 is going after them. You have one of the guys who locks him up, and he's asking the the AWACS to verify it, right? He's got non-cooperative target recognition telling him as a MiG-25, but he can't shoot because of rules of engagement. And later on, that MiG-25 is what shoots down the F-18. So I think that this other point about the actual MiG kill by Mongo, this is when he and his flight are all in air-to-ground mode. And they get cued by the AWACS saying, hey, you got bandits on your nose. And so they all switch to air-to-air mode and pick them up. And then the E2 said bandits, but his flight lead says, oh, they're bogeys. And so he's there saying, wait a minute. And this is, they're closing 1,300 miles an hour closing speed. And they're trying to decide if it's good to shoot or not. So he ends up taking a shoot because taking a shot, and one of his other flight mates takes another shot, and they ended up killing those two MiG-21s. So there's a couple of important points here. Without that AWACS cue, F-18s in air-to-ground mode would have been completely surprised by the MiG-20s, and it would have been the other way around. So AWACS definitely played a big role here. But the other point is rules of engagement were very restrictive, and they almost could have been in a simultaneous fire situation. Very, very close call here. It ended up going the Americans' way, but this was close.
you don't get this detail with the secondary source. You can only get this detail with the narrative from the primary source. So this is, I'm going to contrast that a little bit with the Israeli Air Force performance in the Bekaa Valley in 1982. So this is when they have drones in the air, which are giving them persistent surveillance. Not only that, but there's also a lot of signals intelligence. So they're not actually detecting these as enemy aircraft as they take off. They're detecting them as enemy aircraft when they hear them requesting takeoff from the tower. And that kind of preparation, in addition to the important point is their E2 is passing off responsibility to several F-18s who are managing the battle. So they are avoiding this kind of overload of the AWACS crew. And I think we know that in 1982, this is like held up as the classic demonstration of the F-15 superiority, right? The reputation that the Eagle has largely comes from this. So there's a little contrast here that I think is really interesting. We don't have the same kind of primary sources from Israelis, I think, than we do with the Americans. Israelis are a little bit more closed about this kind of detail. Yeah. Yeah. So let's just look at the history of Link 16. Link 16, the fact that the F-15s and other fighters did not have Link 16 was, that was held up after the Gulf War, saying, hey, wait a minute, I think we need to consider Link 16. Link 16 was actually ready to go in 1975, but it wasn't deployed on fighter aircraft because of size, because of cost. And I think that they realized, okay, we got to correct this situation. There's a big benefit here. One of the really interesting points, I haven't found the actual official source, but from a forum, I found this statement about some air combat testing that the U.S. Air Force did, where they're looking at surprise. And the idea was that the Soviet concept was surprise. This is largely true of the frontal aviation. So MiG-21s taking off from an austere airfield and nobody sees them is very similar to what we saw in Vietnam. So what they said is, okay, F-15 versus F-5, one-on-one, it's very dominant. F-15 is 64-0, at least according to this source. But when you increase that, when it's 32 versus 32, that ratio falls to 2-1 because it's the guy who you don't see is the guy who killed him.
I have an app for that, which is you're pointing your tail at somebody.
Right. Yes, totally true. Yep. So that eventually, because of the need to negotiate with NATO and agree on who was going to produce the electronics and a lot of negotiation internationally, but within NATO, finally you end up, in 1987 you had 25 Eagles with Link 16. Finally, it gets deployed to the whole fleet in 2002. Just in time for the new data links to render it. Right. So this is some of those same testing by the U.S. Air Force. That what they did is that they specifically did some testing with about 12,000 sorties, some 2-ship to 2-ship, but all the way up to 8-ship to 16-ship. And these are the kind of comparisons that they were doing. So you end up having AWACS with voice versus just the red team with just voice. So as you compare that with the same thing, but these guys have Link 16 and these guys just have voice. And their conclusion is that the kill ratio will increase from roughly 3-1, 3.6-1 to 8-1 or 9-1. And I thought that is really interesting. It definitely sells the need for Link 16, benefits of having Link 16. What I'm noticing about this though is what does it make in terms of the assumptions regarding the Red Force? The Red Force does not have ground intercept radar. The Red Force does not have AWACS. And I'm not quite that might be true of MiG-21s and MiG-23s, but is it true of MiG-31s? I'm not quite sure. So that is what I noticed from this study. Let's see.
So if I could ask, they constantly work with the assumption that the opposition doesn't have any similar system?
Yes, these tests only had red team communicating with voice, no data. That's right. So not quite peer on peer.
Yeah.
Right? And you know that even the Vietnamese Air Force, famously had GCI radar, right? They were controlled by ground centers, and those ground centers were off limits to U.S. bombing.
We'll talk.
Yes, yes. So, you know, the future of data links, we've seen the talent hate pod come along, which allows the kind of tries to bridge the gap between F-22s and F-15s. That was tested in 2017. And then more recently, the Einstein box deployed on a U-2 that was tested in 2020. This is, you know, there's probably classified information that is a lot more detailed than this, but there's a continuing need for better networking for air-to-air combat. And these are some of the more recent examples of U.S. Air Force trying to innovate for that, for the whole force, not just for Air Force. Yes. So now let's talk a little bit about the Soviet side of things. So I really like the writings by Richard D. Ward. I think he worked for General Dynamics, if I'm not mistaken. But this kind of sums up the feeling that, you know, the Kremlin has built a ramshackle force of second-rate fighters. That was kind of the feeling that many analysts had, and he's wanting to dispel this by saying, now wait a minute, frontal aviation had a specific mission, right? They had a specific concept, and it wasn't the same as the U.S. concept. And I think it's great to be reminded that, you know, that they're innovating, they have a different conceptualization, and they're not just crappy at building fighters, right? They're not trying to replicate the U.S. Air Force. That was not their idea. I couldn't resist to put this in. This is the quick history of the MiG-25. So MiG-25 comes along because the Soviets get really scared about the XB-70, the Mach 3 bomber, and they designed the MiG-25, the Mach 3 interceptor, right? And this scares the West. They think it's a super plane. They say, oh no, we gotta, you know, this ultimately ends up with FX program, plus a little help by John Boyd, and you end up with the F-15 fighter. So, of course, the famous incident with Belenko defecting in 1976. I recently heard about and was reminded of this because my dad was a civilian engineer with the Air Force at the time, and he was approached by some CIA analysts saying, hey, we have this stuff. Would you help us take a look at the metallurgy on this plane? So that was a kind of a cool connection. I guess I want to mention that Soviet air defense is actually a different service than frontal aviation. So you have the BVS and you have the PVO, and these are different beasts. And the idea when you have the U.S. Air Force against the Vietnamese, or you have U.S. Air Force versus the Iraqis, the kind of networks and equipment that we're fighting is much more like the frontal aviation troops, the kind of troops that you're really going to expect to see in Europe. But even the air defense, that umbrella by the Soviets was, wider than just Russia proper. And I think it's worth noting that they had some very advanced technology, and some of it was well in advance of what we had. For example, this aircraft, the MiG-31, this one had, from the very outset, it had a data link. And that's in 1983. They had the electronically scanned array. It was passive. It's not quite the same as an active electronically scanned array that we have today, but nonetheless, the first AESA radar was introduced on the Mitsubishi F2 in 95. The MiG-31 is flying around in 1983. So the idea that we have that we're going to kind of hit an F-15 head-to-head with an Su-27, that is likely not going to happen. It's going to be much more like this paradigm, where they're fighting as a team. So it's worthwhile to look at what's happening on the other side. So that I mentioned this yesterday, but if you didn't see it, this is Tom Clancy giving a presentation at the National Security Agency. Them asking him, like, where do you get all your data? And he says, Janes and Harpoon. So this is an example of, this is another war game, Command Modern Operations. I took the time, because I'm a data analyst and a data architect professionally, I took the time to decompose this and really understand this database. It really is a fantastic database, but it does have some flaws. This is a good illustration of that. So I'm now comparing that at this website. This is the former name of CMANO, but you can compare, 1-to-1, whatever fighters you want to compare. It's very interesting to me that their MiG-31 has no data link at all. Well, we know that that's not true. So the other thing, when we look at this, if we take that USAF doctrine, first look, first shot, first kill, the F-15C is not going to get the first look with the MiG-31. Not if they're going head to head, right? Maybe if there's AWACS, but if there's AWACS, then the Soviets are probably going to have ground intercept radar. Maybe they have their own AWACS. It's not a given that only the U.S. brings AWACS to the fight. The first shot is probably going to be the R-33, at least in 1983, 1987. This guy, the F-15 is going to be firing the AIM-7M. This is before AMRAAM comes in around 1991. So the first shot's probably going to be the R-33. So now, that said, if the F-15 closes to within maneuvering range, it's not going to be a contest. The MiG-31 is not going to dogfight the F-15. And so it's really important to consider this not as a one-to-one fight. These kind of fights are team fights. You have specialized players in the air. They're collaborating largely through a data network, and you really have to approach the battle in those terms. These are some similar examples. This is Foxhound versus F-15C. This data is coming, straight out of the Harpoon Annex. So you can see that here's this passive electronic array. This is detecting a medium target at about 107 nautical miles, whereas the APG-63, the medium target at about 71. So there's disparity there. Now, this might be a little bit more traditional. This is a flanker, a PVO flanker versus an F-15C, and you can see that it's a different story here. First of all, the flanker is not around in 1983. Flankers, in 91, you have these regiments here, whereas by 91, F-15C is much more advanced. You have a better radar with LPI, low probability of intercept, non-cooperative target recognition, and you have AIM-120s, which is much better than the Soviet missiles. So it's lopsided the other way, and many people would approach this matchup, as a direct head-to-head comparison, F-15 versus flanker. It's not probably going to work out like that. Will this fight occur? Absolutely, it'll occur. But it's going to be a team sport, right? It's going to be a lot of different assets with a lot of specialties facing up with a lot of other assets on the American side too. So an air campaign model is really required to understand what's going to happen, not head-to-head matchups. So this is a current war game that I've seen by the Mitchell Institute. And I was just looking at this and thinking about what their concept was. I'm a little concerned when I look at how they're looking at the red team, right? And what are the red team tasks, right? When I see that the red team is largely there to respond, to surrender the initiative, and I'm thinking this might not be how the Chinese are thinking about it. So this was a little bit questionable to me. It sounds like groupthink by people from USAF, right?
Yeah.
The Mitchell Institute is populated by a bunch of smart guys, but they're all former Air Force guys. And so I'm wondering if how much validity this kind of war game has, if that's what the red team is going to be about. Is the red team really going to put their AWACS on the front line with their stealth fighters behind? Is that really going to be the approach? I doubt it. So that's where I'm at right now. I have been collecting a lot of claims versus losses. I really was looking at this and trying to understand where I wanted to focus. Ultimately, I decided I wanted to focus, at least initially, on the 1991 Gulf War. I've been looking at the statistical survey, Air Power's statistical survey, in great depth, and trying to get as much of the narratives as I can, because I think that we saw some pretty good performance by the Iraqis, but it just lasted a very short time because the Americans were very good at removing the kind of network that the Iraqis had assembled. And without that network, it was definitely advantage Americans. So, but nonetheless, I think that's the best data that we have in terms of the capability of the USAF at that time. And looking at other fights, sure, in Kosovo there were some kills. It would be wonderful to have data from Ukraine, but we're likely not going to see that for a while yet. So this is actually what my plan is for the future plan. I'm going to collect the detailed air victories and losses. I'm going to correlate them. I'm going to share it with you guys and other people who are interested, so that we can team up and have a database that is shared and cross-validated and see if there's other sources that can be combined. I'm going to work on an AI agent a little bit. I'm not sure if I'm going to use a large language model. I might be something a little bit similar, a little bit simpler than that. But I want to replicate some of these historical air battles and see if it can actually be validated with historical data, very much with the TDI approach. I'd like to generate some heuristics based upon that, a lot of simulation, and then roll that up to some heuristics, and then create effectively some combat results models, combat result tables that we can use to, for example, enhance the kind of war games that we have seen with victory games and some of the follow-ons. So that, and I think that kind of a game that's been validated based upon historical data would be a much more interesting battle for people to explore red tactics and to have some open models and some details about how we arrived at this combat result table that's been validated with historical data. I think that would be a little bit better than what we saw from CSIS, a little bit better than what we saw from the guys at the Mitchell Institute, and establish that as a war game that we can use to explore Taiwan scenario, South China Sea scenario, things like that. So that was a very quick tour. How much more time do I have?
You have just about a half hour.
Half an hour. Wow, I made it through the whole thing. Questions?
But, what about the jamming rich environments? Is there any studies done on that to see how the Link 16 will react or all these, well, I think it's Link 22 now, but all these systems? And if our whole warfighting plan is predicated on communicating with each other, if we don't have that, what happens?
Well, Link 16 is jam resistant. And the way that they do that is they have multiple channels. But initially, they had 8 channels that were going to be hopping frequencies.
Right.
But they had to, because of cost, they had to reduce it to 4. So it's jam resistant. It's not jam proof. Maybe the newer technology that we don't know the details of is more jam proof. But I think that it also jamming will have improved as well. So it's kind of a, cat and mouse game. So I think looking at some historical examples, I don't know if we're going to see. We really haven't seen the Russians or the Soviets have the kind of battles that the U.S. Air Force has had. So it's difficult to say how effective their jamming would be. I think that we've seen some pretty effective jamming and some pretty effective technology, but it's a good question. It needs to be included in for sure.
It needs to be included, and yeah, ECM is always good. Like, it's always good behind the black. For those that no longer or never had access to that sort of thing, I'm not sure how you deal with it because it's so important, and yet there's very little information that's available.
It's really hard to model. I mean, the only thing I found that I could do that with was command. And even there, you gotta buy a special feature to do jamming, I think. And beyond that, even radar it's incredibly hard to figure out the true capability of how it works.
Yeah.
But I think that's a great step.
I will say this much, you brought up the Harpoon database. I know Larry and Chris real well, and the radar model in that is really good. And so you can probably take that back. And the stealth, how that fits in with what they're doing, I think is real good.
Yeah.
It may not be precise in terms of our stealth may be better than what they're telling us it is, but it's real. So it's not so much that they have classified information available. They do not. They do not want to go there. But physics is physics.
Yeah.
And they have a real good physics guy. Chris is really good. I think, if the military would have looked at that, they could do a lot more. Because it would be, unclassified.
Yeah. So actually, in the previous iteration of the Harpoon 5 Annex, the MiG-31 and the MiG-25 did not have data link. And I sent them a message on their forum, and I said, hey, I'm not sure that this is correct. Could you please look at this? And sure enough, August 24th of this year, they republished the annex and said, aha, there's data link.
I somehow missed that, but I hate to deflate your balloon just a little bit. That's a PVO asset. They better not be playing with their PVO asset. Basically means you're playing your F-15 over their territory.
In Europe, that I think holds a little bit more weight than in the Pacific, because in the Pacific you had MiG-31
theoretically
deployed.
possible.
So the PVO transferred some MiG-31s
to the Navy to patrol the area around, the Kamchatka Peninsula.
Right.
And also in Sakhalin, at the southern tip of Sakhalin, you have MiG-31 deployed there. So, I was, my own parochial interest of, Asia, influenced that a little bit. So that's what I was thinking.
Have you considered also expanding this further along also to naval warfare? And how that could play in the air warfare aspect?
Actually, there was a paper written using the salvo model and looking at the variety of combat that's occurred with anti-ship cruise missiles. And they did some simulations based upon that, thousands and thousands of iterations to construct what they feel is some pretty good they were looking at the seeker technology as well as the defensive EW, and they came out with some conclusions about which were the most dangerous missiles and the kind of, what kind of salvo is needed to inflict the hits. And so that looking at that naval example actually inspired me to say, okay, we need to do something like that for air. And so I'm when I get down to this point, right, I'm up here, but when I get down to this point, I want to incorporate this so that we have that, anti-ship missile combat and also, air launched anti-ship cruise missiles. So I think that I want to catch up to where they are by doing this kind of simulation for air. That's my goal. So once I get there, then both of them are going to merge. What I don't, in order to get to the Victory Games level, I also have to deal with ASW, right? And I'm not quite sure where that is, right? I'm focused on the air and the naval surface stuff, but there's a whole undersea domain that is more or less secret. I'm not sure that there's a lot. I mean, is there historical examples? Yes, but it's largely diesel submarines. And I mean, we do have some examples. The British nuclear sub that sunk the Belgrande and the Argentinian conflict. That's one example. I'm not sure if there's been another actual combat example of a nuclear sub going after either other subs or other surface ships. So,
first off, you mistaken that with Taco Bell. It's Belgrano.
oh, Belgrano.
Chris Carlson again. He was a Samaritan. And so anything he writes about, you want to pay attention to. That's your interest. And he and Larry did a book. Larry's name is on the spine, but this one I haven't questioned closely, but I think it was Chris's idea. Shattered Trident. You read it?
Shattered Trident. Okay.
It's about what starts out as an undersea war against China, where Japan and India and a lot of the smaller countries are banned up against China because they think China is too big for its britches and it's going to start making real trouble. And it's really a fascinating idea that the war could all be taking place under the ocean. And how do you prove somebody attacked, a particular country attacked you? Poses some really interesting questions. But Chris, again, is one of the smartest guys on the planet and has the engineering knowledge, etc. that when he writes about anti-submarine warfare, he knows what he's talking about.
Yeah.
And by the way, he calls it awfully slow warfare.
Right. Yeah, the harpoon rules are really fantastic. So I'm going to be relying on those pretty heavily.
I had a heavy influence some of that road, some of the rules driveway. And I'm sad to say, my stuff has been kind of washed out of it. My number 5, I probably have no influence.
Okay, thanks a lot, for your comments. Any other questions? Wow, so I'm impressed that I was able to do this faster than I thought.
We got
So,
15 minutes left.
yeah,
Oh,